Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Tales from a Retro Gamer. Today I'm going to be talking about the great video game crash of 1983. Now this is the home console industry in the US specifically. That's the market that crashed and I lived through it, and the reason I started this YouTube channel was because I lived through a lot of gaming history and I wanted to tell stories from someone who was there. Now, 1982 was fantastic for the U.S. home console industry. It was, well over a $3 billion industry. And in 1985, the U.S. home console industry had crashed all the way down to, around $100 million. It was a $100 million industry, down from, around $3.8 billion. Obviously a huge, just a massive crash. And the reasons for this, there were several reasons for this. Primarily, a glut of software by third-party companies for the Atari 2600. Lots of what they call shovelware, just horrible games for the Atari 2600, with shoddy graphics, even for the 2600, really primitive looking, broken gameplay, just awful games that were obviously cranked out very quickly by people who, just weren't really great programmers. One particular company, Data Age, put out just absolute crap games like Snake, Bugs, and Airlock. It's not really a trilogy, but I consider that in my mind because those are three big examples of just terrible games produced during this time. Consumers would go to the store and buy some of these third-party games because maybe they were a little cheaper than some of the regular mainline games from Atari and Activision, and they would come home, after paying $25, $30 for a game and see that it was just crap. So this was a big contributor to the great video game crash. Also, competition from home computers, the Commodore 64, the Apple II, Atari's own Atari 800. Parents would look at these computers, and a lot of them had gone way down in price to where they were actually semi-competitive price-wise with the consoles. Say, why buy a video game console when all it could do was play video games? When here we could buy a computer with a keyboard and we could, balance checkbook, make grocery list, teach the kids the pay and program in BASIC, and all these different educational, you could have educational games and all this stuff, for computers, all these multiple uses. Parents were buying computers for kids instead of consoles because they had just they were so much more useful and they were educational, and parents just felt better about buying a home computer for consoles. So those are the two big contributors, and stores were having a hard time stocking all these games. There was only so much shelf space, so all this shovelware combined with, the popularity of home computers and the lowering costs of home computers really hurt the console industry in the US. Now, there were some other reasons for the great video game crash of 1983 as well. There were smaller reasons now, like my shirt, E.T. E.T. was a very disappointing game for a lot of consumers. It sold a lot of copies, but there were a lot of copies left over. Atari was stuck with a lot. And the game, it was relatively complicated. It was an adventure game, and for kids who didn't, take the time to read the instructions and figure out how to play the game, it was kind of confusing and frustrating. I think E.T. should have been, with a limited time, resources and programming. I think that Howard Scott Warshaw had, who programmed the game, I think it might have worked better as just sort of a simple Pac-Man clone where you went around as E.T., maybe eating Reese's Pieces or something like that. That would have been a simpler game for people to understand. Maybe it would have been done a little better. Anyway, E.T. was obviously not the reason for the crash, but it certainly didn't help. There were some other smaller reasons that didn't help the industry at the time. The poor Pac-Man port, obviously, with the flickering ghosts and, the just ugly graphics and everything. People were very disappointed with that game, the awful sound effects. The Atari 5200 joysticks, the non-centering joysticks. The 5200 was a great console, but it was really hurt by the joysticks. So there were several reasons there. Coleco canceled their Super Game module, and we're starting to focus instead on producing the failed Atom computer. So there were a lot of reasons there, but primarily it was just the onslaught of shovelware, the horrible games, and the mismanagement by Atari didn't help, and and again, home computers were getting popular. So like I said, I lived through the great video game crash. I was 15 in 1982 when I got my ColecoVision, and then I turned 16 in 1983. During the great video game crash, and this was perfect timing for me for reasons I'll get to in just a second. So in 1982, I got my Atari 2600. Obviously, you know, years after it came out in 1987 or in 1977, I was late to the game with the 2600. I played it at my friends' houses all the time, so that was great. But I didn't get one till a few years later. A friend of mine in high school sold me his Atari 2600 with 10 games for $10, which was really cheap even for then. And he did that because the ColecoVision and Atari 5200 were considered the cooler, better game systems. He didn't care about his 2600 anymore. So I did have Atari 2600, and I had a ColecoVision during the crash. And, you know, I would pick up other systems later, but I had these two systems during the crash. And so I picked up a lot of, you know, really cheap games for these systems during the crash. And my first inkling that something was going on in the industry, I didn't know anything about a crash, but it was obvious to me that something was going on because games were suddenly getting cheaper. And the first time I noticed this, so every Sunday morning, I would look through the newspaper and look for video game ads. And one of the cool things my parents did growing up, we subscribed to the newspaper. We got it every day and on Sundays. And I loved looking at the video game ads in the newspapers just to see what was coming out, see the new titles, see some of the older stuff that maybe was on sale, or just see what kind of deals that were going. Well, I saw this ad with Atari 2600 games listed from $9.99 to $14.99. Huge discount, because, you know, used to seeing games for $30, $35, $45, you know, just really expensive games, especially back then. You know, if you consider adjusted for inflation, games were, you know, $70, $80, $90. And so that cued me into that something was going on. I didn't really think of industry terms or what was bad for business or, you know, consumer markets or anything like that. Just to me, you know, I was a teenager playing video games, and I thought, wow, cheap video games, that's pretty cool. And so it just so happens, like I said, in 1983, I turned 16. 2 days after my 16th birthday, I got a job at Luther's Barbecue, and I was making $3.35 an hour, which was minimum wage at the time, and a pretty decent, you know, amount of money for a kid in you know, the 80s, a teenager. And so suddenly, for the very first time in my life, I had a lot of money because I was working a lot of hours, 30 to 35 hours a week, which was kind of crazy in high school. But anyway, I became a supervisor, and within 6 months, I was making $5.50 an hour, which was really a lot back then for a teenager. And so I had a lot of money, and, you know, I was still living at home, obviously, and I didn't have, you know, bills or, you know, really many expenses. And so I was freed up to buy a bunch of video games. And so what I started doing, I would drive around to the different stores as I saw these video games coming down in price. KB Toys, Toys R Us, Children's Palace, and I would go and see these discounted games, and I would fill in holes in my ColecoVision collection because I was, you know, a big OG ColecoVision fan, and, you know, I was there from the beginning just about because I got a ColecoVision in Christmas of 1982, and so that's always been, you know, my favorite vintage video game console. So my objective was to buy, you know, just to get every game I didn't have. I would buy ColecoVision games if I didn't have one in my system, you know, for my system in my library, and, you know, it was there and it was $10 or cheaper, I would typically get it. So I was going from store to store, you know, and the games just got cheaper and cheaper. You know, at first $9.99 to $14.99, quite a few titles. Well, then suddenly I'm seeing $4.99 and then $2.99, and then, believe it or not, 99 cents. Atari and Television, ColecoVision, Atari 5200, you know, Vectrex. That was another thing with the great video game crash. There was a glut of consoles, the Bally Astrocade. You know, there was, you know, like 6 or so systems vying for, you know, the market as opposed to 2 or 3. And so it was just a crazy time. And these stores would have these big bins out front, kind of like you see Walmart now with their DVDs, those big bins with just, you know, tons of games with prices anywhere from 99 cents to $4.99, you know, and, you know, in the late 83 and into 84, you know, it was just a great time to be a game collector, to be a game player, a game buyer. And just real quickly, 3 titles for the ColecoVision that I remember getting that I'm very fond of during this time that are kind of hard to find today. Squish 'em featuring Sam. I really like this game, Squish 'em Sam. It's a kind of a climbing game, a non-scrolling platformer. It's a lot of fun. And Flipper Slipper. It's kind of a cross between Breakout and Pinball. It's a lot of fun as well. Really obscure games that, a lot of third-party titles were in these bins that I was checking out. Chuck Norris Super Kicks. It's not a great game. I mean, Chuck Norris can basically be damaged by grass in this game, which is kind of funny. But it is fun, and it's a really early beat 'em up. It was a beat 'em up game way before Double Dragon and all those kind of games came along. Anyway, those are just a few examples of games I bought during the great video game crash. Unfortunately, I threw away my boxes years ago. So there's a particular time in '83, I had my car, I had my money from working at Luther's Barbecue, and I was going around buying these games. Well, I got grounded for some reason, and I cannot remember why. And it was a pretty significant grounding. It was like a couple of weeks, and I could only go to school, and I could only go to church, and that was it. My mom would, and work, and I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't go out with my friends, no extracurricular activities, nothing like that. Basketball, of course, I could do because that was school related. I could do my the things that were considered responsible and that my parents wanted me to do, but I couldn't have any, fun going anywhere. And so I'm very sorry, Mom, about this. But what I did was I told my mom that I needed to stay after school for several days in a row because I was working on this, English project, something like maybe just this big book report or something. I think it might have been I don't remember what it was. It was just some major project. I might have even made it up. I don't know. But I told my mom I had to stay after school at the library every day. And so I would do that, and then I would go on to work. And, God love her, my mom assumed I was telling the truth, and what I was doing instead of being at the library, I was going around and hanging out at the malls and checking out the toy stores for, looking for, super cheap games to add to my collection. Mostly games I wanted to play. Like I said, for ColecoVision, I was filling in holes in my collection. I would buy anything I saw. But for Atari and some, if a game looked interesting to play, I would buy it if it was cheap enough. And so, in particular, I would go to the North Hills Mall near my house in North Richland Hills in, the Fort Worth area. And I would hang out there. I would go to the movie arcade. I would go to Aladdin's Castle. And I would check out KB Toys, just checking out all the cheap games. I would get a slice of pizza and a, orange Julius maybe, like a soda or something. And sorry, Mom, but I was having a really good time after school during the great video game crash of 1983. Now, I had no idea these companies were suffering. That didn't really enter my mind. I didn't care. I was, 16 years old. I was just having a great time buying cheap games and sort of bucking the system a little bit by not being, ungrounding myself, sort of. And so, sorry about that, Mom, but it was some good memories, and thanks for putting up with me during my teenage years. I was kind of a wild child, but I had some fun, but mostly harmless. But anyway, so the market crashed in '84 and '85 were a really bleak time for the video game industry. Atari and Mattel barely held on with the Atari systems and the Intellivision. They held on for a few years, but the ColecoVision went away. The 5200 was canceled. The Vectrex lived a tragically short life. That was such a great system. And the U.S. home market was just absolutely dead in 1985. And the Nintendo NES obviously brought it back in '86 and '87 when it was it was test marketed in '85, but then released to wide, across the country in '86, and then it started getting popular in '87, and especially 1988 and '89. And during this time, the video game magazine market had crashed too, but Nintendo came in with Nintendo Power in 1988, so that kind of helped bring back the video game magazine market as well. And anyway, so I lived through the crash. It was a really fun time to collect games, to be playing games. You could get a lot for a little bit of money, and it was really great since I had a job and a lot of money for the first time. Now, the market hasn't really crashed since. There have obviously been some failed systems. I remember seeing stacks and stacks of Sega 32X for $10 a piece at Toys R Us. I remember KB Toys had Atari Jaguars, bought, brand new ones for $30 each. Individual games and individual systems would obviously fail, but the industry itself has not crashed since the great video game crash of 1983. Anyway, so guys, for some of my older viewers out there, tell me in the comments, did you live through the crash? Do you remember the crash? What were you doing at that time? Were you going around buying games like I was? Do you remember it? So comment below. I'd really appreciate it. Some of you younger gamers, what have you heard about the crash? What do you find interesting about it? Comment below. Thanks for liking the episode. Thank you so much for subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate it. We're growing pretty fast here. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will talk to you guys next week. Peace out.